Hello and good day, everyone. My name is Zack Hegarty. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a graduate student in Virtual Heritage Informatics at Indiana University. My talk today concerns an aspect of a larger project about the famous Temple of Zeus at Olympia. Specifically, I will discuss how we created digital models of the West Pediment sculpture group. This is a collaborative project involving, at various levels, myself, Professor Andras Pate-Horvat, and my doctoral advisor, Professor Bernard Fischer. The institutional framework is provided by the Virtual World Heritage Laboratory, or VWHL for short, an activity of the Virtual Heritage Program at our university. Additionally, for permission to photograph, study, and publish online the 3D models of the West Pediment, we thank the Effort of Antiquities of Ilia and the German Archaeological Institute at Athens. The aim of this project was to create photogrammetric state models of the temple's West Pediment and to prepare them to be freely published online on the Digital Sculpture Project website. This is a web-based repository of digital models relating to our lab's various digitization projects, including, notably, the Uffizi, Indiana 3D Digitization Project. So let me begin with some background information on the West Pediment sculptures themselves. As you can see here, from this photo of a gallery housing them in the Archaeological Museum in Olympia, the group consists of 21 figures, which are in more or less fragmentary condition. They were sculpted in Parian marble for the Temple of Zeus, which was built between roughly 475 and 455 BCE. The group with which we are left today includes these Parian originals, but also a few possibly later pieces carved from Pentelic marble. Thematically, the group represents a version of the Centauromachy myth, wherein the Lapith tribe of men have just hosted a celebration of the marriage of Pirithous and Diademia, to which they unwisely invited the centaurs. So, as these half-horse, half-human Mishvason tended to do, they became inebriated and attempted to make off with the Lapith women. And with that, we have arrived at the scene which this group depicts: the kidnapping of the Lapith women, their defense by the Lapith men and the hero Theseus, which you can see here. Finally, we have the god Apollo, located in the center of the fray, and in the bottom left here. He is obviously larger than the rest, and is dramatically stretching his arm out to one side, perhaps signaling the victory of the Lapiths and Theseus. Now that we have some context for the sculptures, some background for the digitization project itself is in order. The digitization of the West Pediment stems from a larger project undertaken in 2009 by Professor Andras Pate-Horvat to digitize the entirety of the temple. He started by digitizing the East Pediment, which is seen at the top here. In 2015, he added some of the metopes, especially those which were well preserved. These digitization campaigns were completed with structured light scanning methods. Additionally, digital reconstructions were created of the temple architecture and also of the cult statue. As such, only the West Pediment remained to be brought into the digital format. And so, his prior work constrained the present study, as there was a desire to not only create web-ready models, but also to create them in a way that facilitated their integration into the rest of the digital temple. The process of digitizing this pediment was begun in 2014, and was ultimately completed with photogrammetric methods. The first step was to undertake a photographic campaign of the sculptures as preserved in the Archaeological Museum of Olympia. This was conducted by Bernard Fischer in 2014 using a Nikon D600 camera to take 3,722 photos of the 21-figure group. Subsequently, I took up the project and began modeling in 2021. The modeling process I used employs the method developed by our lab to output web-ready models from photogrammetric data. The method involves, in broad strokes, 4 preparatory processes: photocorrection, photogrammetric production, retopologization, and finally, texture mapping. Application of the 4 processes allows for high-fidelity models that are also computationally light for interactive use online. The 5th and final step, of course, is actually uploading the models online. This was done using the service Sketchfab. We will shortly be making available the West Pediment models, freely available on a new section of the Digital Sculpture website at the URL you see on this slide. But for the moment, I would like to take you through the 4 modeling processes in greater detail. The first step in this method, photo correction, took place in Adobe Lightroom, wherein the raw format photos from the 2014 campaign had their white points corrected, highlights reduced, shadows evened out, and had their tonal values averaged with Lightroom's autocorrection function. Editing the photo set in this way allows for the maximum of captured information concerning the subject matter to be eventually identified and extracted by the photogrammetry software. At this point, the photos are renamed with a logical naming system and exported as JPEGs with highest settings. By way of an example, the edited photo from the model of figures P and Q on the right is much more tonally flat in comparison to its original counterpart that you can see here on the left. This allows more detail to be seen by both the eye and eventually the photogrammetric software. Now that we have cleaned up the photos, it's time to move on to the next step, producing the photogrammetric models with the program software Agisoft Metashape. First, I used all of the photos to produce a model of the entire pediment. However, I quickly realized that the resulting model would be far too heavy to run online. So instead, the photo set was broken up into smaller sets representing chunks of the pediment and run in Metashape individually. The subgroups of figures were divided partly on how some are connected, as you can see here a bit, and also on their usual representation in previous studies of the pediment. For instance, the monograph published by Ashmole and Yaloris in 1967 on the Olympia sculptures. So, after importing their respective photo sets, for each subgroup, a sparse point cloud was generated in Metashape. At this point, the gradual selection tool was used to remove all points with a reconstruction uncertainty greater than 25 and a reprojection error greater than 0.3. The Optimize Photos tool was also run against the remaining points. These 3 steps help to reduce some of the noise that can sometimes be generated on the surface of the resulting model by removing outlying points and reducing what is called the root mean square reprojection error. Next, the sparse point cloud was processed using depth maps to create a 3D mesh. At this point, the models had approximately 10 to 20 million polygons each, still quite large, but a reasonable number to work with in the subsequent steps. A small amount of editing was completed at this point to remove some background and errant geometry. However, no holes were filled so that the modeler's hand, so to speak, touched the mesh hardly at all. Lastly, the model was exported as an OBJ for use in the next process. I should also note that a color texture map was created at this point. This was for reference use in subsequent steps and not for the final product. With this process now complete, we moved on to retopologization, which was done using ZBrush by Pixelogic. Just as a note, retopologizing refers to modifying the mesh or the digital skin of the model to make its structure more regular and reducing the overall complexity of the polygons. This process is really what makes for a computationally lighter model and aids us in the process of getting these models web ready. So the first step was to import the Metashape version of the model into ZBrush and duplicate it so that an unmodified version could be used in later steps. Now, as I begin working in ZBrush on the duplicate model, I made some quick verifications on the mesh by using ZBrush's Mesh Integrity tool, which checks and fixes for things like non-manifold edges. Following this, duplicate points were welded together to further ensure the mesh's integrity. Next, the polygons of each subgroup's mesh were transformed into quadrangles, or quads as I call them. ZBrush has an automated method to accomplish this, and it serves 2 purposes. First, it is the primary way to create a more regular mesh. But second, it also serves to radically reduce the number of polygons overall. And because this is done in a regular way with quads, it is more predictable and easier to account for when we try to recover some of that lost detail in later steps. Next, logical UV maps needed to be created to prepare for texture mapping. To do this, the meshes were divided into chunks, which would become 2D islands during the UV process. Additional subdivision layers were added to the model, and finally, the mesh was automatically unwrapped using ZBrush's UV master system. So with all of that completed, we can begin the process of recovering that lost detail. This is done by projecting the original Metashape version of the mesh, which remains in parallel within ZBrush, against the newly decimated and unwrapped version. Projecting, especially at high subdivision levels, produces a mesh strikingly similar to the original, while maintaining the regular topology that was created in the previous steps. After completing the projections, we now have a mesh which can be exported as an OBJ. However, each subgroup, for instance, the P and Q group, as you can see here, required two versions to be exported. The first was the highest subdivision mesh, which has the most geometry. This mesh typically had about the same number of faces as the Metashape original, and so retained nearly all of the original detail. The second exported file was the third subdivision mesh. This mesh is what would actually be deployed online, and resulted in an OBJ file which was just below the limit for the maximum model size which is allowed by Sketchfab. Additionally, just before it was exported from ZBrush, this mesh was lightly smoothed to reduce any jagged edges which the projection technique created. So at this point, we are left with two meshes for each subgroup, one very high resolution, high geometry mesh, and one medium resolution mesh. And now the next process is to create texture maps to recover some of that lost detail. The first map to be created is a color map. This is done by re-importing the medium resolution mesh into Metashape and using the already aligned photogrammetric data to project the color data onto that newly generated mesh. The resulting color map texture is then exported as a JPEG. The second map to be created is a normal map, which is the purple one you see here. Normal maps store light bounce information, and as such can in 2 dimensions store fine details that would in 3 dimensions require very complex geometry. This is where our very high resolution mesh comes into play. Within the normal map generating program called XNormal, we were able to plug in both ZBrush meshes and generate a normal map. The program operates, in essence, by capturing the very high resolution mesh's details and projecting them onto the medium resolution mesh. The result is baked into a 2D texture, which was then exported as a PNG. So with that, we have a web-ready model by combining the medium resolution mesh, the color map, and finally the normal map. These were uploaded to Sketchfab and subsequently embedded into the Digital Sculpture Project website. Ultimately, the beauty of this web-ready method is that it radically reduces the complexity and thus the file size of the models, while simultaneously retaining nearly all of the detail of the original, unmodified version of the mesh as produced by Metashape. For instance, looking at the model of P and Q here, when it was exported as an OBJ directly after its creation in Metashape, it was 2.3 gigabytes and had nearly 18 million polygons. After processing the mesh in the manner described previously, the file size is reduced to 93 megabytes and has just under 800,000 polygons. Thus, we have a massive reduction in compute power required to manipulate online the models while only sacrificing just a bit of detail. The path forward for this project is twofold. The first goal is to correct any lingering errors in the mesh that may have been overlooked and making any corrections to the modeling process so that we end up with the most clean and accurate models possible given the data at hand. The second goal is integrating the West Pediment models into the rest of the digital Temple of Zeus, as previously created by Professor Pate Horvat. Work has already begun in this direction by my lab colleague, Mohamed Abdulaziz, who, as you can see here, has expertly combined the West Pediment models on Sketchfab. Further reconstruction work will be required to integrate the West Pediment within the rest of the digital temple, but with complete state models in hand, this is readily achievable. So to wrap up, by leveraging the power of photogrammetry, this study was able to efficiently produce state models of the West Pediment sculpture group and utilize digital tools to create web-accessible models for public and scholarly use. Additionally, this online deployment pipeline gives further credence to the fact that combining high-fidelity visualizations with computationally light photogrammetric modeling is possible, and it ultimately can provide the best of both worlds, accuracy and accessibility, to the models of these unique artifacts of cultural heritage. Thank you all for your time today, and many thanks to CHNT. As you can see here, please feel free to contact me at zhegarty@iu.edu with questions or comments. In a week or two, you should be able to view the models on the Digital Sculpture website at the URL on the screen here. Thank you all very much.